Before I get into the substance of this program, firstly, I need to both offer a correction to yesterday's program and also an apology. An apology, firstly, to you, my viewers, but also to the national interest. Now, yesterday I discussed this article, which had appeared in the national interest on the 21st of August 2021, written by Mr. Wes Mitchell, in which Mr. Wes Mitchell, months before the conflict in Ukraine started, or perhaps I should say the current iteration of the conflict in Ukraine started, had suggested that in order to split the Russians and the Chinese from each other, the United States should organize insuperable obstacles, as he put it, to Russia's westward expansion. And he specifically spoke about engineering a Russian defeat in Ukraine. Now, that was written 6 months before the current iteration of the conflict began in February 2022, when the Russian army entered Ukraine. Now, I'd at regular intervals looked up this article on the internet, and it seemed very different to me from the article which I had remembered. And then yesterday, a member of the Duran community provided me with the text of the article from the archives, and it did indeed seem to be exactly as I had remembered it, and different from the article as it appeared on the internet. Now, that, I have to say, weighed on me. I was concerned about the fact that there'd been what appeared to be not just editorial changes, but a very substantive rewriting of the article, apparently to omit the reference to the United States engineering a defeat of Russia in Ukraine. And whilst I could perhaps just about understand why Mr. Wes Mitchell might not have wanted his original article to appear in its original form, I have to say I was a bit concerned that the editors of the national interest had allowed the article to be rewritten in that way. Well, as it turns out, I have once again been let down, and I have to say this frankly, by my own poor vision, and I'm also going to say this also frankly, by the fact that I can't compensate for my vision issues with an editor to go over my work and to point out where I've gone wrong. And it turns out that what I had been seeing as the current version of the article appearing on the internet was in fact just the last page of that article. I had particular problems, I should say, with numbers, and I wasn't able to see that at the bottom of the page of the article as it appeared on the internet, there were a series of numbers which showed that it was the last page as opposed to the first one. If, in fact, you read the whole article through, then you will find that, in fact, the article, as it appears on the internet, is the same as it appears on the archives and the same as I remembered it when it first appeared back on the 21st of August 2021. Now, I say that I don't have an editor who's able to compensate for my vision issues, but I have something equally good, which is the Duran community. Over the course of yesterday, various people helpfully explained all of this and pointed it out to me in a string of, I should say, extremely generous emails. I want to take this opportunity to thank all of those people for that correction. I also want to say that I'm sorry that this mistake took place. I do apologize to anybody who may have formed the wrong impression from my program yesterday. But I also want to apologise to the national interest for thinking that they'd agreed to changes to the article, which they clearly have not done, but principally also to express my relief that these changes, which I thought had happened, have not happened. I have to say, I was bewildered and frankly very concerned that there appeared to be changes to an article which had been made. I'm afraid I have seen other examples of such things happening, but not, it must be said, in the national interest. And I was beginning to become, well, in fact, I was becoming very concerned that it might be happening there as well. Well, it turns out that it has not. I'm very relieved to be able to say that, and I want to make it clear that I'm sorry, and I apologise to the national interest for my mistake. My last comment, however, about this affair is that it has been helpful in one important respect, which is this: it has brought that West Mitchell article from the 21st of August 2021 back to attention. It means that people are now reading it. I hope more people will read it, because though I don't know the whole story of what was going on in the United States, in the high reaches of the American government and political system back in the summer of 2021, to my mind, that article does point to one important fact, that there were discussions in the United States at that time which do seem to have envisaged some kind of conflict in Ukraine, resulting in a Russian defeat and a subsequent reorientation of Russian foreign policy in favor of the West and against China. So that discussion was taking place in the United States at that time. And I have to say, I can't imagine, I find it impossible to believe that that is unrelated to the events that took place thereafter, and specifically the events which took place in February 2022. So that's what I wanted to say about this issue. Sorry again, my apologies to the national interest. It's good to know that that article by Mr. West Mitchell is still there and still easily accessed. I think it's an important article, and it does, in my opinion, it shows not just prescience in terms of what happens, but I have to say this, I think it gives a clue to the kind of discussions which were taking place and the intentions of some people in Washington. Well, having said all of that and having given my apologies, I think the right thing for me to do now is to proceed with the rest of this program. And obviously, much of this program, though not all of it, is going to be dedicated to a discussion of the Prigozhin affair, the latest development in the Prigozhin affair, a topic which, by the way, I'd hoped after the failure of his mutiny last June, I would be able to put behind me. But anyway, it has now resurrected itself in the most tragic way, with news that an aircraft, which almost certainly was carrying him, a business aircraft, has crashed in the Moscow region, with a very strong probability, the overwhelming probability, that he was on board and that he has been killed and that he is therefore dead. And I have to add those last caveats because as of the moment of making this program, the Russian authorities have not yet formally confirmed that his body has been identified. The manifest apparently shows that he was on the aircraft which crashed, but it's not yet been conclusively proved that he is dead. A body which is presumed to be his has been found, but DNA tests will take place, and we won't know for sure that it really is him until those tests have been done. Having said that, I think, as I said, that it is overwhelmingly likely that it is Prigozhin. And though Prigozhin is an extraordinary individual, has been an extraordinary individual, one who has an extraordinary ability for concealing his actions, putting us on all sorts of, throwing dust in people's eyes. There have been earlier reports, by the way, reports from some years ago, that he was killed in an air crash in Africa, which turned out to be untrue. He is a man with apparently multiple identity documents and has used multiple identities and has used disguises in the past. So it's not entirely inconceivable that he is still alive and that this is all some kind of elaborate scheme to make us all think that he is dead. I have to say that I think that that is incredibly unlikely. And from this moment on, in this program, I assume that he was on that plane and that he is indeed dead. Now, this has happened 2 months after the failure of his mutiny. Many people are perhaps jumping to conclusions about that and are using the timing to suggest that there was foul play. I do, as it happens, think that there was foul play, but I want to make it clear that the fact that the plane came down with Prigozhin almost certainly in it 2 months after his mutiny seems to me to be almost certainly a case of coincidence. Now, I said that I think that it almost certainly was foul play. I have to say as well that as of the moment of making of this program, I don't think that the possibility of an accident can be completely excluded. Firstly, it does seem that this was an old aircraft, a relatively old aircraft. It was an Embraer, a aircraft that has not been properly or fully serviced by Embraer themselves because they're prevented from doing that as a result of Western sanctions. It is possible that it was not in good working order. Prigozhin is an individual who can take, or who did take, extraordinary risks, who comes across to me to have been frankly reckless with his own life, that the team, the other people who were with him, who were basically the top commanders within Wagner, had the similar reckless courage that Prigozhin had, and it might be that they were flying a plane which wasn't safe, and that this all went tragically wrong, causing the accident which we have seen. Now, I know these can be excluded. I know that there's lots of people already speculating about the causes of the crash, and there's people have been poring over the pictures and coming to all kinds of conclusions about how the aircraft came down. I'm not in any kind of position to say this. I know that there is a view that an accident, based on the available evidence, cannot be completely ruled out. And I'm afraid that, to my mind, remains the case. Having said that, when dealing with an individual like Prigozhin, who has more enemies than one can count, more people who might wish him dead than, well, the vast majority of us fortunately have. The likelihood that this was a murder of some kind must be the greater prospect, must be the greater likelihood. And I would say that though we have not yet had any definitive information coming out of the investigation, sources in the Russian media, places like Redovka and other parts of the Russian media, are now suggesting that the most likely cause of the crash was some kind of internal explosion, most likely caused by a bomb. It's been suggested that it was planted either in the hold or the landing gear, and that this somehow was what caused the crash. A surface-to-air missile has been apparently all but ruled out. I say all but ruled out. This is a continuing investigation, and that might change. But so far, as I understand it, the aircraft was flying above the altitude at which a man-portable missile could have reached it. A missile like a Stinger. It's higher than most commercial drones would operate, or indeed the kind of drones that Ukraine has been using to attack Moscow could reach. And we're talking about the much more powerful, much bigger surface-to-air missiles like the Buk missile or the S-300 and S-400 type missiles. Well, it seems that there would have been clear indications if it had been one of those sorts of missiles that had brought this aircraft down, smoke trails and that kind of thing. And there is no evidence of that at all. The same, by the way, applies to the possibility of it being an air-to-air missile. There would have been some kind of smoke trail. And again, the film of the incident apparently doesn't show that. So, who might have been responsible? Well, if you go to the Western media today, if you listen to what Western governments are saying, if you listen to President Biden, you would assume that there can be only one suspect, and that is Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, and his government. It's taken as axiomatic that they and he were responsible for Prigozhin's death. Now, I have to say that there is some reason to think that that might have been the case. But I'm also going to say that there are also lots of reasons for doubting it. And I personally, as of this moment, don't think it was the case. So let me first of all say what the reasons might have been. Well, first of all, Prigozhin did lead a mutiny, which in my opinion was more than just a mutiny, but an attempted coup in June against the Russian government. He said that he was not aiming to overthrow Putin himself, that he only wanted to force the dismissal of the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, and the chief of general staff, Valery Gerasimov. But as I pointed out at the time, had he achieved his objective, the person who would have been appointing and dismissing ministers in Moscow would not have been President Putin. It would have been Yevgeny Prigozhin, and power would, in light of that, have shifted from Putin to Prigozhin, and who would have become, in many respects, a potential de facto ruler of Russia. So whatever Prigozhin himself understood by what he was doing, it does seem to me that Putin himself and the officials of his government would certainly have seen it as an attempted coup. which, as far as I'm concerned, is what it was. So, a government that has been the target of a coup attempt, might be expected to take strong action to suppress the coup plotters. Putin, in fact, came to a deal with Prigozhin back in June, brokered by the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, whereby Prigozhin was allowed to go to Belarus with such part of the Wagner organization which would follow him. Some people in the West interpreted that, wrongly in my opinion, as a sign of weakness, but one can imagine that Putin was visibly very angry at the time of the events in June, might have borne a grudge, might have felt insecure whilst Prigozhin was alive and still in charge in some form of the Wagner organization, and might have wanted to put Prigozhin out of the way. And if Putin himself perhaps didn't feel like that, one can also imagine why other people within the Russian government might have felt the same way. People within the Russian Defense Ministry, people within some units of the Russian army whom Prigozhin had insulted, people like that. And I'm going to push this even further and say that there were some events in the run-up to this death, this crash, which, if you want to join up the dots in a certain way, might reinforce your conclusion that it was the Russian government and the Russian authorities that were behind all of this. Firstly, Putin had this meeting with Prigozhin and the leaders of the Wagner Group in July. Putin offered the commanders of the Wagner Group the opportunity to sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense as a collective single unit rather than as separate individuals. The commanders of the Wagner Group seemed, according to Putin, inclined to accept that. Prigozhin, however, intervened to stop it happening. One could argue that this was a last-ditch attempt by Putin to separate Prigozhin from the Wagner Group, and that when it failed, Putin might have decided that there was no way that Prigozhin's grip on the Wagner Group could be broken unless Prigozhin himself was put out of the way. Second is that 2 months would be about the necessary amount of time one might expect for investigations of Prigozhin and of the affair to take their course, for the Russian leaders to be fully informed about what actually happened in June, and also for the Russian security services to organize this assassination, if that is what they were instructed to do. And then a couple of days ago, we got the news that President Putin himself had met with the military leaders of the Russian armed forces in Rostov-on-Don. Gerasimov himself was there. There was a discussion. We're not told very much about what happened, but again, if you want to join up the dots in a certain way, perhaps Putin went there to reassure the military leaders that Prigozhin would indeed be put out of the way, or in the alternative, to gain their support before taking the step to do it. And then last but not least, we've had news, or I should say reported news, it's not been officially confirmed, of the dismissal from his position as chief of the aerospace forces of General Surovikin, who Prigozhin himself tried to claim was his friend, and who much of the media in the West has assumed was his friend, and supporter within the defense ministry. And again, you could say that if somebody in the Russian government was planning to put Prigozhin out of the way, then you remove a perhaps potentially disloyal general from his post so that that general could not take any step either to protect Prigozhin or to avenge him once Prigozhin had been put out of the way. So if you wanted to construct such a theory, there is material there which would enable you to do it. It is far less than a case. It might be a reason to ask questions, but it's certainly not a case you could take to any courtroom. Well, I'm going to say straight away, I don't actually think this happened. I don't think Putin or the Russian government had any role at all in this affair. Firstly, I don't think Prigozhin actually did represent any kind of threat at the moment to Putin. There have been suggestions that Prigozhin, still active, still around, might have been minded to launch another coup at some point. Given the total failure of the previous one, I can't imagine that Prigozhin, who whatever he was not a fool, would want to go down that particular route. And I can't imagine that Putin was really worried that he would, or was worried that the rest of the Wagner organization would follow Prigozhin if he tried. So I don't think Prigozhin was any kind of threat. I don't think Putin, who is a calculating man, would bear grudges in the way that some people are suggesting. I don't think Putin needed Prigozhin out of the way in order to assert his authority, as some people in the West are saying. And I think that there were compelling reasons to doubt anyway, on the basis of what we already know, that Putin and the Russian authorities were involved. Firstly, why, if a decision had been made to remove Prigozhin from the scene, go about it in this extraordinary way? Why blow up his aircraft, not just with Prigozhin, but with the rest of his staff on board, but more importantly, with pilots and crew of that aircraft, entirely innocent people, killed, opening up questions, leading to possible investigations? Why do it in this very public way? Prigozhin has been saying that he might be going to Africa. He indeed published, just before he was killed, a video of himself claiming that he was in Africa. If he was indeed intending to go to Africa, and all the indications suggest that he was, surely if Putin and the Russian authorities wanted him out of the way, or indeed wanted his executive team out of the way, the place to arrange it was in Africa. You could have snipers or hitmen or whatever you like, do it quietly there, and you could say convincingly that it was the result of enemy action. So why do it in this public way, killing innocent Russian civilians, which might open up investigations and embarrassing questions? And secondly, why do it in the middle of the BRICS summit of all things? It is a huge event. Putin has been actively participating in it through video link. Big decisions have been made. He spent all of the last 2 months reassuring the other leaders of the BRICS that his position in Russia is stable and secure, that the coup attempt launched by Prigozhin back in June has not affected his position or Russia's internal stability in any way. Surely the last thing that he would want to do at this particular moment would be to remind the leaders of the BRICS of the Prigozhin affair. that, to my mind, is one of the single most important and strongest reasons why it's all but inconceivable that Putin himself would have been involved. So I don't see that Putin had a compelling motive. Prigozhin was not a threat. Prigozhin was not someone that Putin needed out of the way. He was not a danger to Putin's authority. Putin did not need to reassert his authority by getting rid of Prigozhin. The facts, the circumstances of the killing do not point to Putin or the Russian state. They could have done it in a much more contained way, off stage, if you like, in Africa, sparing themselves the embarrassment of a massive investigation on Russian territory. And last but not least, Putin surely does not welcome the embarrassment of having this event take place in the middle of the BRICS summit. Now, saying all of this, I have to admit this immediately, doesn't prove that it was not Putin, does not prove that it was not the Russian state. I can only offer my opinion. I don't know, but I'm entitled to my opinion, as we all are. And my opinion is that the arguments against Putin's and the Russian government's involvement are much stronger than the arguments in favour. Others are entitled to a different view. I leave that to them. Now, one further reason for doubting that it was Putin and the Russian government is that there is, unfortunately, an overabundance of other potential suspects. Prigozhin had an extraordinary life. He was an individual who has been involved in lots of different activities for many years now. And it's in fact an indisputable certainty that his complicated life, the violent way in which much of it has been conducted, will have created for him all sorts of enemies, some of whom are at least as violent as he himself has been. So let's just tick them off. And I'm not, by the way, going to investigate this in detail. I'm just suggesting potential suspects. I'm not saying that any one of them necessarily, by the way, are the actual perpetrators, but let's just list who they might be. Firstly, it's entirely possible that this has been the product of an internal power struggle within the Wagner organization itself. I should say that one member of the Duran community who is very familiar with the setup in Russia, he lives there, he's contacted me and he says that in his opinion this is the most plausible explanation. After all, the people within the Wagner organization are themselves tough, ruthless men. Some of them might be extremely angry with Prigozhin for all sorts of reasons, amongst which, of course, was the fact that he has done the organization very considerable damage by launching that coup attempt in June. It is not inconceivable that some of them might have wanted him out of the way. And, of course, being inside his organization, they would presumably know which plane he was on, who was with him on that plane. They might be able to penetrate his security, which was also provided by the Wagner organization. They might have planted the bomb on the aircraft. That's not to say that that's what happened. I'm just saying it's a potential scenario, not an implausible one. The second is other people in Russia who might have been involved in some way in his coup attempt. There's been lots of speculation that when Prigozhin launched his coup, he was backed in doing it by some Russian oligarchs unhappy about the political change that Putin is currently engineering in Russia and hankering perhaps for some kind of reconciliation with the West. Once the coup attempt failed, these people might have been potentially exposed. They might have been worried that Prigozhin, alive, might at some point disclose their identities to Putin or to the other Russian investigators. They might have concluded that for their own security and self-interest, they needed to get Prigozhin out of the way. If they're wealthy and powerful people, they might have been able to corrupt some members of the Wagner organization. They might have been able to track Prigozhin's movements. They might have arranged to put him out of the way. And there's a third category of people. In the run-up to the fighting in Bakhmut, and during the fighting in Bakhmut, Prigozhin recruited tens of thousands of men from Russian prisons, and he threw them into the battle of Bakhmut, often with no more than just a few weeks' training. And by his own account, some 10,000 of these men were killed in that way over the course of the fighting. The Russian Defense Ministry was horrified by what was happening. So apparently was Putin himself. In February of this year, they stopped Prigozhin's further recruitment in prisons. By the way, the Russian authorities have set up a new structure to recruit prisoners into the Russian armed forces, distinct from Wagner. These prisoners now get much better military training. But anyway, the point is, Prigozhin did recruit thousands of men from the prisons. He threw them into Bakhmut. 10,000 of them were killed. Many, many more were injured. Many of these people have a criminal and violent background. They will have families. They will have friends. They will have people who were in some ways close to them and perhaps involved in their lives. They might feel angry with Prigozhin for sacrificing the lives of these people in the way that he did in prison, in the fighting in Bakhmut. And it's not inconceivable that they too would have wanted revenge against Prigozhin for the death of their relatives and for the death of their friends, and that they might have worked together to put him out of the way. And with Wagner having several people with criminal backgrounds on its payroll as full-time employees, again, it's not impossible that criminal networks might have reached out to them, might have been able that way to track Prigozhin's movements, might have in that way managed to insert a bomb on his plane. So that's another possibility. And then, of course, there are other people who are not connected to Russia at all. They're the Ukrainians, and Ukrainian officials who've been speaking about Prigozhin's death, people like Yermak and Podolyak, have been gloating about it. They talk about Prigozhin belonging in hell, extraordinary comments of that nature. And of course, it's important to remember that by Ukraine's own admission, they have been more than willing in the past to carry out murders of people on Russian territory. And the Ukrainians have all but admitted it. In fact, they bragged about it. And the United States, via the usual leaks by anonymous officials, has also said that Ukraine has a habit of doing this and has in fact done it. And names like Daria Dugina, Vladlen Tatarsky, and all sorts of others including many of the leaders of the Donbass militia, come to mind. So it's not impossible that it was Ukraine. They have carried out sophisticated operations of this nature in the past because of Prigozhin's falling out with the Russian authorities. The Russian authorities are unlikely to have been providing Prigozhin with any kind of security. It's not inconceivable that Ukraine might have also successfully penetrated Prigozhin's Wagner organization, kept track on his movements, smuggled a bomb on his plane, carried out the murder in the way we've talked about. And then, of course, there are potentially some of the Western powers. Now that, I suspect, is going to elicit the strongest pushback of all. But the United States carries out extrajudicial killings of people that they consider terrorists. Extrajudicial killings. There have also been things like extraordinary rendition. There have been all kinds of things of that nature. They've never shown much concern about doing that. The previous United States President, President Trump, ordered and carried out the killing of General Soleimani of the Iranian forces. The United States might have a reason for wanting Prigozhin out of the way. Apparently, it's on the brink of declaring Wagner some kind of criminal or even terrorist organization. It's worried about Wagner's activities in Africa. It's worried about Wagner's activities in Belarus. It has a crisis in West Africa following the coup in Niger, and top US officials like Tony Blinken and Victoria Nuland have been warning the government, the new authorities in Niger, to have no dealings with Wagner. So it's not inconceivable that at a time like this, with the situation in West Africa particularly complicated, with Wagner apparently coming back to Africa, with Prigozhin releasing inflammatory videos about how he was going to expand Russian influence in Africa and lead Africa to liberation, it's not impossible that the United States might have decided that enough's enough, we have to put this person out of the way. And again, the United States has the most elaborate and best organized, or at least largest, intelligence organization in the world. I don't think it is beyond the realm of the possible, if they decided to do this thing, that they would have been able to do it. Again, let me stress, it's pure speculation. I'm not even speculating now. I'm just floating possibilities. As a matter of fact, I personally don't think it was the United States, but one can see that they might have had motives to do it, and they have done such things in the past, and the very recent past as well. And of course, if we're talking about Western powers, it's not just the United States. What about France? France is seeing its entire geopolitical position in West Africa crumble. It's worried, apparently, about Wagner arriving in Niger, the jewel in the crown, if you like, of France's informal empire in West Africa. Again, France, which also has a history of direct action in order to defend its interests, might have decided to conduct an operation of this kind. Though again, I have to say that I think it unlikely, not because I think the French are unable to do a thing like this, but because I don't personally think that they have the ability to do it so deep inside Russia. So you can see that there are lots of potential suspects. In fact, there are probably many more suspects than I've mentioned or have any knowledge of. The kind of life Prigozhin led makes that all but certain. I've heard some very dark stories about Prigozhin, for example, and Wagner dealing with blood diamonds in all kinds of activities of that nature in Africa. I don't know whether those stories are true. They might be lies or smears, but if they are true, that too might have got Prigozhin involved with some pretty dangerous people, and they too might, for their own reasons, want him out of the way. Though whether they would have, again, the resources and the organisation to be able to carry out a murder of this kind is another matter. But given the range of suspects, why focus on just one? Why say it must be Putin and it must be the Russian state? I would have go further. I would say that precisely because Prigozhin had this major falling out with Putin and with the Russian state, that might have made many of his enemies feel that he was suddenly vulnerable, that he did not have the protection of the Russian state any longer, that the Russian authorities were no longer therefore taking steps to protect him, and that the Russian authorities might not take steps to avenge his death. And that might have acted as an incitement to some of these people to take the step they might have longed to take for a very long time, to put Prigozhin out of the way. So there we go. The only other thing I'm going to say about this affair, well, I'm going to say two things about this affair, which is that if, as I think it was murder, the fact that the entire command staff, alongside Prigozhin, of Wagner, was on that plane, does suggest that somebody, whoever it was, who carried out this murder, had a great deal of information about what Prigozhin was up to, and that it has something to do with Wagner itself and a desire to put Wagner in its entirety out of the way, and that might narrow the possible list of likely suspects. And perhaps the second thing, which is that there is a Russian investigation underway. Sometimes these investigations that the Russians carry out don't go very far, but when they do take place and they do go a certain distance, my experience is that the Russian investigators are actually very thorough and they provide quite a lot of information eventually, even if they don't ultimately name a suspect, as has been the case in previous murders, like, say, those of Politkovskaya and Nemtsov and others, that would enable a complete resolution of the affair. And when the Russians do provide information, that too can be useful in narrowing the list of suspects. So I would say this: at the moment, my interpretation is that it is unlikely that it was Putin and the Russian authorities. I'm not completely excluding that possibility. There are arguments which can be made to the contrary, but I don't think they carry as much weight as the contrary arguments which argue in the other direction. There are lots of other potential suspects, but we're likely to learn an awful lot more in due course of time, and that might give us a better clue as to what actually happened. There has to be, it must be said, however, a real possibility, especially with an individual like Prigozhin, that this affair will never be fully settled, that we will never have the complete picture of what happened, and that whoever it was who was behind this thing will be able to remain elusive. There it is. Prigozhin was an extraordinary man. He lived much of his life in the shadows. To the shadows, I'm afraid, he is likely to vanish back into, and we can't be certain that the final proof of what happened and of the people who were behind it will ever come to light. Now, I'm going to say, before I leave this topic, a little about Prigozhin himself. I think he has been an extraordinarily colourful personality. He is somebody who did undoubtedly possess certain very strong features. He was strong-minded. He was extraordinarily brave. He was charismatic. He was inspiring. He forged an incredible bond within the Wagner organization. He is somebody who will certainly, his departure will certainly be noticed. I think that in the end, though his military achievements in terms of the capture of Popasnaya and Solidar and Bakhmut by the Wagner Group will always remain, I think his disastrous decision to launch the coup against Putin, the event which in some form or other has probably cost him his life, well, that decision has unfortunately tarnished forever his achievement. And though there might be some disturbances in Russia as a result of his death, it's possible that some Wagner fighters might be embittered and might decide that elements of the Russian Ministry of Defense were involved and that they might provide a security problem for the Russians for some time. I think that ultimately and overall, though Prigozhin will never be forgotten, I think that the importance of his death is probably being overstated and over time will fade. So there it is. I don't think this is going to affect Russia's internal stability. I certainly don't think this event is going to affect the course of the war. But an extraordinary individual has left the scene and has left a mass of questions behind him. Right, well, Prigozhin's death is not the only big event that has taken place over the last couple of hours since I made my last program. There have been other things. Let's start with the situation in the battlefronts in Ukraine, because today is the 24th of August. It is Ukraine's Independence Day. It's a day which Ukraine was hoping to commemorate, I think, with the capture of Rabotino, as I discussed in my program yesterday. And in fact, Ukraine did indeed make, as I also discussed in my program yesterday, a very urgent attempt to capture Rabotino. And it seems that at one point yesterday, they were in physical occupation of around 70% of the village, and they did manage to raise their flag over the local administration building of this village. However, what happened over the subsequent hours was that the Russian army launched a counterattack, and the Ukrainians were driven back, and the central part of Rabotino, where the flag had been raised, came back under Russian control, And the very last report that I've received, which I don't, by the way, consider completely reliable, but anyway, the very last report that I've seen is that intense Russian artillery fire and Russian counterattacks have pushed the Ukrainians out of Rabotino entirely. And if that was the victory that Ukraine was anticipating that it might celebrate on the 24th of August, well, as of the time of making this video, it doesn't seem as if they will be able to celebrate it. In fact, there was a press conference with Zelensky yesterday in which I got the strong sense that Zelensky had been looking forward to announce over the course of the press conference that Rabotino had indeed been captured. The failure to capture and consolidate control of Rabotino left him looking, I thought, disorientated and somewhat depressed. He had to admit that the offensive was proceeding with difficulty, and he found himself faced with unwanted questions about the prospects of a general mobilization in Ukraine, over the course of which he had to make admissions that because of the very high losses Ukraine is experiencing, another mobilization might indeed have to take place, and that the Ukrainian military are pressing for it. So, bad news for Ukraine in Rabotino. And elsewhere on the battlefronts, it seems that the Russians are continuing their push towards Kupiansk. There's been again a dearth of news about what exactly is happening there, because all of the news has been taken up with the Prigozhin affair. But my sense is that again the Russians are doing what they always do before they attack an important populated settlement. They pick off all the surrounding villages, they clear out all of the fortified positions around it, they cut off communications, and they've been apparently destroying also some of the remaining bridges that Ukraine was using across the Oskol River to keep their troops in Kupiansk supplied. And I remain of the view that over the next few days there will be a Russian attack intended to capture the eastern part of Kupiansk. That's the situation in the north. Now, Ukraine has been trying to make up for the lack of progress on the battlefronts by conducting a succession over several days of drone attacks on Moscow. All I will say about these drone attacks is that apart from causing a significant amount of disruption to Moscow's airports, the drone attacks appear to have achieved very little. The damage on this huge city has been incidental, and I don't think that the Russians are bothered by it, and I don't think it is affecting Russian actions in terms of the war. The Ukrainians did attempt some kind of a landing in a small area of Crimea. This is 2 boats with commandos. Apparently they came, they fired a grenade launcher, at least that's what the Russians claim, and they left. The area where this happened is interesting because it is an area where Ukraine claimed a day before that a Ukrainian drone destroyed a Russian S-400 surface-to-air missile installation. And Ukraine has provided pictures of this. Now, some Russian sources, including Riba, have said that Ukraine did succeed in carrying out a drone attack on a Russian air defense installation. They deny it was an S-400 system. They say it was a less sophisticated S-300 system. Again, I've been somewhat burnt by the business of the photo with the picture of the Tupolev 22M3 burning, I've seen a significant amount of pushback from people assuring me that that photograph is a fake. I'm not able to say one way or the other. I do get the sense that sometimes Ukraine exaggerates what it achieves, and I also get the sense that it's not beyond Ukraine to provide information, faked photographs, to support those kind of claims. So I'm not going to comment on what happened and whether a Russian air defense installation really was destroyed in Crimea. I think it might have been, but I'm not going to say that it was, because I simply don't know. What I can say with some confidence is that the Russians, for their part, are producing multiple pictures of more drone attacks by the Russians and missile attacks by the Russians across Ukraine. And whether by coincidence or not, some of these pictures show Russian missiles or drones destroying Ukrainian air defense installations, including some with S-300 missiles. Again, I'm not going to judge the accuracy of these pictures. I'm not the kind of person who's able to do that. I just report it for what it is. So overall, a bleak day for Ukraine in military terms. They've not managed to achieve anything substantial on their Independence Day, though all the indications are that they pulled out the stops in order to do so. And we've had some really, I find, most concerning, indeed alarming news. And this comes in the form of an article in the New York Times, which speaks of a recent conference that took place, video conference, in which the participants were General Zaluzhny, the commander of Ukraine's ground forces, and the person who is in overall charge of Ukraine's offensive in the southern regions, and Zaporozhye and Kherson region and those sort of places, and a rather alarming trinity of Western military officials. Mark Milley, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States, General Karoli, who is the US general, who is the overall military commander of NATO in Europe, and Admiral Radakin, who is the British Chief of Staff. Anyway, according to the New York Times, these three officials were extremely critical of Ukraine's conduct of the war. And they made it absolutely clear that they strongly disagree with Ukraine's attempts to capture or recapture Bakhmut, that they think that this is a major diversion of effort. They want Ukraine to end its attempt to capture Bakhmut, to withdraw its forces that are trying to conduct the offensive towards Bakhmut, to concentrate them all on the southern front, where the West remains committed to the original plan for this offensive, a breakthrough through the Surovikin line towards Tokmak and Melitopol and Berdyansk, all the way to the Sea of Azov. They want Ukraine to forget about Bakhmut, to carry out an all-or-nothing attack, in effect, on the southern front lines before autumn closes in. Now, I have many concerns about this discussion, which undoubtedly did take place. Apparently, for the record, General Zaluzhny agreed with what these Western military leaders were telling him. He agreed that he would do it. He's, to my knowledge, been skeptical about the Bakhmut operation all along. Whether he's able to prevail against Zelensky and Syrskyi, who've been conducting the operation in Bakhmut, is another matter. But anyway, my major concern is twofold. The first is simply this: who is defending Ukraine? Is it the Ukrainians who are defending Ukraine in order to defend their own country? Is that what is happening? Or is it rather a case of the United States and Britain running a war against Russia, in which they have some kind of plan of their own to break through to the Sea of Azov and perhaps ultimately take over Crimea? Who ultimately is responsible for the conduct of this war? Well, many of us all along have thought that most probably it's the United States that is. We now see that that is indeed the case. Ukraine supposedly fighting to defend itself, to preserve its independence, to survive as a sovereign state, is not able in the end to make its own decisions. It's not being allowed to conduct its own war, or what it has been told is its own war, in the way that it wants. It's been told by its Western sponsors what it should do. Now, I don't happen to think that this offensive towards Bakhmut is a good idea. I've always said I'm not an expert in these matters. I've encountered some humour when I say that, but it's true. And I can see why some Ukrainian officers, perhaps Syrskyi himself and others, might argue that on the contrary, it is in the Bakhmut area that Ukraine has the best chances. I've discussed many times how elsewhere along the battlefronts, the Russians, since the autumn, have been able to construct these enormous, elaborate fortifications which Ukraine has failed to break through. The one place where they were not able to do that was around Bakhmut, which the Russians only captured on the 20th of May, which did not provide for enough time to create strong fortifications. The absence of those fortifications, one could argue, makes the Bakhmut area a more attractive proposition for a Ukrainian counter-offensive. They're more likely to achieve something in Bakhmut than they are anywhere else. But the United States, Britain, they're saying no. Whatever your feelings about this, whatever your thoughts about Bakhmut, whatever your thoughts about the overall importance of Donbass, forget all about that. Concentrate instead on Melitopol, on Berdyansk, on the Sea of Azov. That's where we want you to fight. That's where you should fight, with the implicit threat that if Ukraine doesn't do that, well, the Americans and the British always have the option of walking away. We see how, in reality, a war which Ukraine is telling itself is intended to secure its independence has actually lost Ukraine its independence. Ukraine is not able to decide for itself how it should defend itself. It has to defer to the wishes of the United States. The second concern that I have is about the utter callousness of this demand that these Western military leaders are making to Ukraine. Because, again, the New York Times accepts that a concentration of force, Ukraine throwing everything it has towards Tokmak and Berdyansk and Melitopol, that's going to incur huge losses for Ukraine. That apparently is something that the Ukrainians themselves should not be too concerned about. After all, Doesn't seem as if the Americans and the British are that concerned about it either. They apparently feel that they have some kind of a right to tell Ukraine where Ukraine should sacrifice the lives of thousands of its men in order to achieve tactical objectives set for it by its masters in London and Washington. I have to say that, again, I find that frankly shocking, and I wonder whether American and British generals and political leaders would be so reckless of the lives of their own citizens as they are asking, or rather telling, Ukraine to be about the lives of its citizens. But there we are. That's another reason why I'm deeply concerned. I have deep misgivings about all of this. And then the third reason is whether this can even work. I mean, Ukraine has been throwing force after force to try to capture Rabotino. Yesterday, the 47th Mechanized Brigade, or what's left of it, tried alongside the 82nd Airborne Brigade, the one with the Strikers and the Marders and the Challenger 2s. And the reports now, which are dribbling in, speak of heavy losses, that the 82nd Brigade, one of the last, perhaps the last elite brigade left in the Ukrainian armed forces, has now also suffered heavy losses. There have been pictures all over, you can find them if you want to hunt for them, of burning Strikers and burning Marders on the steppes. Well, apparently that's not enough. Not enough that the 47th Brigade has been sacrificed and the 82nd Brigade has been sacrificed. You've got to sacrifice even more troops. Troops who are probably run down and exhausted, who've been fighting for months this grueling and, in my opinion, by the way, pointless battle in Bakhmut. You must redirect them and send them towards the Russian fortified lines, across those minefields, through this ghastly village, ghastly in terms of the losses that have been incurred in order to capture it, which is Rabotino. You must send all of these men to try to break through. They weren't able to break through in Bakhmut, where there are none of the fortifications and minefields that they will find in the south, but they're expected to do it where other brigades, much more heavily equipped brigades, like the 47th and the 82nd, have failed. I have to say that the way in which decisions are being made now, not just in Kiev, but in the West, utterly bewilders me. Anyway, there we are. Note that as a result of these discussions, the discussions that took place between Zelensky and the West, the word peace, the word negotiations, doesn't appear to have featured at all. And for the moment, the entire word in the West, at least amongst Western governments, even as they seem to be intent on exploring unworkable plans for negotiations with each other, is continue the war until the Russians are either bluffed and intimidated or exhausted through some sort of a stalemate into agreeing to a settlement on American terms. And I'm going to say here that I think it is time now for those voices in the West, in the United States especially, who are calling for negotiations, but who speak about the need for negotiations to avoid a stalemate, to stop doing that. Because this presumption that the war is heading towards a stalemate is, in my opinion, disastrously wrong. I've discussed this before. I've said that instead of a stalemate, we are looking at an unstable equilibrium. The Russian forces are gaining in strength and power all the time. Belitsky, the Russian-appointed governor of Zaporozhye region, has just had a meeting with Putin in Moscow. By the way, this came directly after another meeting that Putin had with the head of the Lugansk regional government. Belitsky came out of that meeting dropping heavy hints that he'd heard from Putin, plans, that there were intentions for the Russians to begin some kind of general offensive, perhaps in the autumn. That may be wrong, that may be misdirection, who knows? But sooner or later, a Russian offensive will come. Ukraine is bleeding to death. The fact that there's all this talk about a further mobilization confirms this. The West is out of shells and equipment that it can send to Ukraine. The alternatives are not between a Ukrainian breakthrough and a stalemate. The alternatives are between a Ukrainian defeat in this offensive and an eventual collapse. That's the reality. Larry Johnson, on his blog Sonar 21, has been writing recently some pretty good pieces about this. I think that people who call for negotiations in the West would be getting a lot more attention if they did what Beeb and Webb did in their article in Time magazine, if that article that recently appeared in the National Interest, also calling for negotiations, were also heeded. Both Beeb and Webb and the authors of that National Interest article put it starkly and correctly. Ukraine is facing defeat. That is the prospect the West is also facing now. That is why negotiations are becoming urgent. Anyway, that's where we are with the situation on the battlefronts. Whether there's going to be an offensive in the autumn, I don't know, of course. As I said, it might have been a misdirection on Belitsky's and Putin's part. In time, we will find out. But with every day that passes, the prospects of a Ukrainian breakthrough dim, and I don't think anybody any longer seriously expects it to happen. And I think calls that Ukraine sacrifice thousands more men in order to pursue this mirage of a breakthrough is beyond callous for all the reasons that I have said. I'm going to wrap up this video with a quick discussion of what's happening at the BRICS summit. And the big decision that we've heard about so far is that there's been apparently a decision to expand the BRICS. I've not yet seen a formal announcement to that effect, but I understand that one will be made over the course of the day. And the countries that are apparently going to join are Argentina, Ethiopia, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. And this is a very interesting selection of countries. What has clearly been happening is that there's been a bargaining going on between the various BRICS states. The Chinese are driving very hard to expand BRICS. They want BRICS to evolve into a global trading system, with China obviously at the center. They're focused on commodities and industrial strength and agricultural strengths as well. In other words, products, hard products that can be physically traded. And the countries that are being selected to participate in the BRICS are being chosen with that criterion in mind. Now, the Chinese will have especially wanted Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to join, because these are the two leading countries in OPEC and in the Gulf in terms of oil production, and they will provide, together with Russia and Iran, also major oil producers, a energy backstop to the BRICS and to the new financial system that the BRICS are apparently intent on creating. But in order to get the other BRICS states to agree to the inclusion of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran, China has had to agree that the other BRICS states are able to choose to pick countries that they want to join the BRICS as well. So in India's case, I get the sense that they wanted Iran to join, because India has strong relations with Iran. So does Russia, by the way. The Russians have pushed hard for Egypt, a country with which they've had historically very good relations since the 1950s, when Khrushchev and Nasser came together and agreed to the creation of the Aswan Dam, with the Soviets playing a big role during the 1956 Suez Crisis, and subsequently in the 1960s during the so-called War of Attrition. There was a period under President Sadat when relations between Egypt and the Soviet Union deteriorated, but since then they've become very close. The Russians today, major investors in Egypt. Many Russians go to Egypt for their holidays. There's talk about setting up an industrial park in Egypt. And of course, Egypt controls the Suez Canal. So Russia, friendly relations with Egypt. They wanted Egypt in, and they've got it. And South Africa wanted another African country. And that African country, it turns out, is going to be Ethiopia, the oldest of all African countries in terms of its state history, which goes back all the way to the Roman Empire, the time of the Roman Empire. It's one of the oldest nation states in the world, by the way. And Ethiopia also happens to be a country with which the Russians have historically had very close relations, going all the way back to the time of Emperor Menelik II in the late 19th and early 20th century. So the Russians also would have wanted Ethiopia to join, and Ethiopia, it seems, is going to do so. And yes, Ethiopia is a poor country. It's rich in resources. It's rich in history. It's potentially, if it's developed properly, agriculturally very rich. And before the recent conflicts in Ethiopia, the ones that erupted about a year ago in Tigray region, Ethiopia was experiencing a double-digit growth rate. So it's a potentially rich country. So Ethiopia is also joining. And then, of course, the Brazilians wanted a Latin American country. President Lula has been forging close relations with the current government of Argentina, and apparently he's managed to get the other BRICS states to agree to Argentina being included in BRICS, despite the fact that Argentina is going through another one of its seemingly unending succession of inflation crises, hyperinflation crises. Who knows? Perhaps membership of the BRICS will finally enable Argentina to put those problems behind it. As I discussed in a recent program, I don't fully understand why Argentina has these problems. Potentially Argentina, a country with huge resources, an enormously advanced agriculture, strong industrial base, an educated population, and a profound cultural history, well, it too, one can see that it would make potentially a valuable addition to the BRICS. On the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I have discussed how the BRICS is evolving from a club into a proper organization. It is an expanding organization, something which the G7, by the way, simply cannot be. And the interesting thing about the BRICS is that it is expanding first and foremost now as a trade organization, bringing together major commodity producers in food and energy, other raw materials, Argentina, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, potential industrial producers, Russia, where manufacturing growth in the second quarter of this year was also in double digits, incidentally. Argentina, which has a strong industrial base. Iran, which also has a strong industrial base, as by the way does Egypt. And Ethiopia, which is also keen to industrialize and which also has great potential ultimately as a food producer. And this will be only the first step, or so it seems, in expanding BRICS. And whilst all this is going on, the BRICS are working on refining their new financial system to enable this trade structure to cohere and take shape. And my sense is that the eventual plan is to go on expanding the BRICS until it becomes the next global trading system in place of the Western-oriented trading system, which we have known and which has existed in some form or other since the 16th century. So there we are. That's the BRICS. There'll be a lot more to say about that. We've done a program about it, Alex Christoforou and I, on the Duran. You can find it there. Anyway, a consequential and important day. I, for one, am sorry to see Prigozhin go. I have to say that I've been very critical of him. I do think that his departure does leave a gap. I mean, he was an extraordinary individual at a time when, frankly, there are few enough of those in the world. And he did achieve some remarkable things. I think there will be many other people, I have to say this, including in Russia, who will be very relieved to see him go. And I think that must also be said as well. But his life ended in tragedy, and given the kind of life he led, perhaps he always knew it would and understood that it could not be otherwise. Well, that's the program for today. More from me soon. We'll see what happens with the offensive and the Ukrainian offensives and any possible Russian offensives as well. And in the meantime, also more to say, no doubt, about the BRICS. Thank you for joining me once more. Just to say again, you can find all of our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, Telegram. You can also check out our shop, links under this program. You can also support our work via Patreon and subscribe, links under this program also. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. And all that now remains is for me, as always, to wish you a very good day.